He wasn't a king, he wasn't a warrior, yet kings feared him, and warriors obeyed his words. He was a thinker who never needed a throne to control the world. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and his weapon wasn't a sword, it was the human mind. In the city of Florence, 1469, the streets glittered with art and echoed with betrayal. Behind every saint stood a sinner, behind every promise, a plan. And in the middle of it all, a quiet young man watched. He didn't see beauty in cathedrals or poetry in statues. He saw weakness, patterns, opportunities. While others dreamed of peace, he studied conflict. While others prayed to God, he took notes on men. He began to notice something no one else dared to see, that power did not belong to the righteous. It belonged to those who understood how people think. He saw priests preach purity and steal in the dark. He saw soldiers die for honor while their leaders lied for gold. He saw that fear ruled, deeper than faith ever could, and slowly, a dangerous thought took root. Maybe morality was just another mask people wore to hide their hunger. Machiavelli never shouted. He never begged. He simply observed. Every gesture, every betrayal, every tear shed for self-interest. He watched the world play its game of deception and decided he would master the rules. Years later, he entered government service, not as a soldier, not as a noble, but as a diplomat, a listener among liars. Moved through royal halls filled with painted smiles and sharpened tongues. He understood that every handshake hid an agenda. Every compliment was a test. To survive, he had to become invisible. And in that invisibility, he found clarity. He realized truth was not a moral thing. It was a tool. People weren't loyal to honesty. They were loyal to advantage. Whoever controlled the illusion controlled the outcome. He wrote letters, studied behavior, watched kings rise and fall, and one lesson repeated itself again and again. The world rewards the cunning, not the kind. He began to understand the anatomy of manipulation, how hope could distract, how fear could discipline, how charm could destroy. He didn't judge it. He documented it. He wrote of rulers who smiled as they killed, of allies who turned enemies overnight, of lovers who betrayed for power. He saw humanity stripped of its disguise, and for the first time, someone dared to say it out loud, that goodness without strength is nothing. That power, not morality, decides history. But even as he climbed the political ladder, he stayed an outsider, admired for his intelligence, distrusted for his honesty. He knew too much. He saw too clearly, and every man who hides behind virtue fears the one who can see through it. Late at night, under the dim light of a candle, he would write notes in silence, not prayers, not poetry, blueprints. Blueprints of how power truly functions, how leaders think, how followers obey, how fear keeps the machine turning. He wasn't inventing evil, he was describing it. He was documenting the truth others pretended not to see. In the quiet of his room, he would whisper to himself, "If you wish to rule the world, you must first understand it. If you wish to understand it, you must watch, not judge." Machiavelli didn't want chaos. He wanted control, not the control of nations, but of the narrative, the hidden script that made kings and crushed fools. He knew men would rather be deceived than face reality. He knew that truth, when spoken too loudly, can burn its speaker. So he stayed silent, collecting the language of power, the smiles that meant danger, the promises that meant nothing, the kindness that hid ambition. And as he pieced these fragments together, a darker kind of wisdom emerged. To lead, one must act like a beast while appearing like a saint. To survive, one must play the game better than the liars who invented it. He would later call this mindset virtù, not virtue as in goodness, but the skill of shaping destiny with one's own hands. A man who possesses virtù bends fortune to his will, and that, he believed, was the highest form of intelligence. The world didn't understand him then. They still don't. They called him immoral, heartless, manipulative. But the truth is simpler. He just stopped lying to himself about what people are. Every era hides a mind that doesn't fit among the rest, a mind that doesn't chase dreams. It dissects them, a mind that doesn't follow the rules. It writes them. That mind belonged to Machiavelli. And as he watched the world twist itself in hypocrisy, he smiled, not out of joy but out of recognition, because he knew what was coming. The rise, the betrayal, the exile, the moment when truth itself would be used against him. But before the fall, there was understanding, and from understanding came power. Low music fades. The voice softens. He wasn't a monster. He was a mirror, and the world has never liked what it sees in the mirror. Florence, the heart of power, corruption, and art. The city was ruled not by faith, but by fear. And in this chaos, one man watched silently, waiting, calculating. Niccolò Machiavelli had learned the first law of survival. Never stand in the spotlight until you can control it. So he worked from the shadows, a quiet diplomat sent on missions across Europe to meet kings, princes, and popes. He wasn't there to flatter them. He was there to study them. Every handshake, every speech, every smile that hid a sword. He studied Cesare Borgia, the man who ruled through terror and charm, the prince whose cruelty brought peace faster than mercy ever could. Machiavelli didn't love him. He admired him, because Borgia was everything he had written about in silence, the perfect blend of intelligence and ruthlessness. Fortune, Machiavelli once said, favors the bold, but only the prepared can seize her. Watching Borgia, he understood something terrifying. Power is not about strength, it's about perception. A ruler doesn't have to be loved, he just needs people to believe he's untouchable. He learned how rumors could become weapons, how a single gesture could build loyalty or destroy it. He saw Borgia smile at men he planned to kill, and kill those who smiled too confidently back. And Machiavelli took notes. He wasn't learning cruelty for its own sake. He was learning control, because in a world where everyone lies, the man who lies best survives longest. As Florence's envoy, Machiavelli met popes, generals, and kings. He played the fool when he had to, the friend when it benefited him, the ghost when silence spoke louder than words. He didn't believe in fate, he believed in timing, every action, calculated, every silence, strategic. He once wrote, "Men are moved by two things, fear and interest. Control those, and you control them." He began to see the world as a chessboard, and every player, noble, priest, or beggar, was a piece. Some sacrificed willingly, some unknowingly, but in the end, all were predictable. To Machiavelli, morality was just a story told by the weak to control the strong, and religion, a mask, designed to comfort the fearful and restrain the powerful. He wasn't an atheist. He was an analyst. He didn't deny God, he just didn't see him in politics. While others prayed for justice, Machiavelli watched injustice create empires, and in that silence, he began to write. He filled pages with observations, not theories but evidence, not philosophy but data. Each note, a map of the human psyche. He saw how leaders manipulated kindness, how they faked humility to gain power, how fear made obedience look like loyalty. He began forming his own code, rules for rulers, laws for liars. Rule 1, appear virtuous, act strategic. Rule 2, promise everything, deliver only what benefits you. Rule 3, if you must harm someone, do it completely so they can never strike back. Rule 4, fear lasts. Longer than love, he wasn't creating a manual for evil, he was writing a cure for naivete because the world was already cruel. He just refused to pretend otherwise. But every mind that sees too clearly eventually becomes a threat. As Machiavelli's influence grew, so did the whispers. Too clever, Too dangerous. A man who can read your thoughts is a man you must destroy. And Florence, that city of masks and daggers, turned on its own thinker. Political. Storms rose. Allies betrayed allies. The same nobles who once praised his genius now feared his insight. They saw in him not a servant, but a spy of the truth. The Medici family, powerful and unforgiving, returned to rule Florence, and in their eyes, Machiavelli was the enemy of the old order. One night, soldiers came to his door, chains replaced his pen, interrogations replaced his studies. They tortured him, not to find secrets, but to break the man who knew too many. He said nothing. He confessed nothing. He only smiled, because even in agony, he understood something profound. Power changes hands, but fear remains the same. When they finally released him, broken and humiliated, the man the world once called a strategist was now an exile. No money, no influence, no allies. But what they couldn't strip away was his knowledge, and that knowledge would soon become the most dangerous book in history. Alone, in a small village outside Florence, he picked up his pen again. No longer a diplomat, no longer a servant. Now, a writer with nothing to lose. He began to pour his mind onto the page, not for fame, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. He wrote about what he'd seen, the lies, the betrayals, the faces of men who called themselves noble. He wrote about the illusion of morality and the mechanics of control. He wrote a book that would make the powerful tremble and philosophers rage. It would be called The Prince, and though it was written in exile, it would echo through empires for centuries, because it wasn't just a book. It was a mirror, and those who feared it most were the ones who saw themselves inside it. Slow fade, tense music rises. The strategist had fallen, but his mind, his dark, relentless intelligence, was only just beginning to rise again. He had once walked among princes and generals. Now, his footsteps echoed in silence. The man who had studied the world's most powerful rulers was now a prisoner of their fear. Niccolò Machiavelli, the strategist, the observer, had fallen. When the Medici family reclaimed Florence, they came like a storm. Old alliances burned, new loyalties were bought, and anyone connected to the previous regime was marked for destruction. Machiavelli's name was on the list. He was arrested, dragged through the streets, thrown into a cold cell. The walls dripped with water and blood. The air smelled of iron and betrayal. They tortured him for answers he didn't have, and for truths he refused to speak. Each lash across his back was a reminder that knowledge is a dangerous form of power. But even in pain, his mind never broke. He realized something terrifyingly beautiful. The world doesn't destroy the weak. It destroys the aware. After weeks of suffering, they released him. A broken man in body, but not in mind. He returned to his small farm outside Florence. No servants, no position, no respect, only silence and time. Every morning, he'd put on his tattered clothes, walk through the fields, and think about the irony that the man who once advised rulers now lived among peasants. But when night fell, he would change. He would wash the dirt from his hands, light a candle, and put on his old robes, the robes of a statesman. He would sit at his desk as though the world still listened, because for him, power wasn't a title, it was a perspective, and with every stroke of his pen, he built a new kind of empire, not of armies and gold, but of ideas. That's when the prince was born. He wrote not as a servant, but as a surgeon dissecting humanity. He didn't write for kings, he wrote about them. He described them not as they should be, but as they truly are. No poetry, no illusion, just raw, unfiltered truth. He wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." The words were not advice for cruelty. They were warnings about human nature. He understood that love is fragile, but fear endures. He wrote that rulers must learn to lie, not because lying is noble, But because people want to be deceived, they crave comfort. More than truth, he revealed the darkest paradox of leadership, that morality and effectiveness rarely live in the same heart. He didn't create monsters. He described the ones already wearing crowns, each page cut deeper into the illusion of virtue. He stripped politics down to its bones, naked, ruthless, and honest. And as he wrote, he realized something about himself. He wasn't documenting evil, he was documenting survival. Machiavelli understood what few dared to admit: that good men often fail because they refuse to play the game, and those who refuse to play are doomed to be played. The manuscript spread quietly through Florence, hand to hand, whisper to whisper. Some read it in awe, others read it in horror. To the powerful, it was blasphemy. To the wise, it was revelation, and to the fearful, it was prophecy. He had written the truth, and truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. The church called him immoral. The nobles called him wicked. But behind closed doors, they all read the prince. They all underlined the same words, and they all learned from the man they condemned. Machiavelli never saw himself as a villain. He saw himself as a mirror, reflecting humanity's hunger for control. He once said, "Men are ungrateful, fickle, and deceitful, but they are also predictable, and that makes them manageable." He didn't seek chaos. He sought clarity. He didn't believe in fairness. He believed in understanding, and yet despite his wisdom, he was never restored to power. No ruler wanted to employ the man who had written the manual on manipulation itself. So he lived his final years in quiet exile, a philosopher among fields, a strategist with no war to fight. But history has a strange sense of irony. The man Florence ignored became the mind the world couldn't forget. Generations later, kings, generals, and presidents would read his words in secret. They would use his lessons in diplomacy, in war, in business. Even his enemies would become his students. And though his body faded into the earth, his ideas began to rule from the shadows. Machiavelli's fall was never truly a defeat. It was a transformation. He had lost everything except the one thing that mattered most: his understanding of power. And understanding, he knew, is the purest form of control. Music builds, slow, ominous strings. They called him the devil's writer, but perhaps he was just honest in a world built on lies. Perhaps he didn't invent darkness. He only revealed that it had always been there. As the candlelight flickered beside his final manuscript, Machiavelli smiled one last time, because he knew the world would try to bury his name, but it could never unlearn his lessons. The mind that had fallen had already rewritten the rules, fade to black. Whispered line, "Power doesn't die, it adapts." He sat alone with his book, The Prince, finished and glowing in candlelight. The ink was still wet, the air still thick with his thoughts. To the world, it was just paper. But to Machiavelli, it was revelation. He had turned pain into principle, exile into enlightenment. What began as a letter to power became a blueprint for those who would rule the world. He didn't write for the moral or the meek. He wrote for the few, willing to face reality, the kind of minds that could walk through deception without being deceived. Machiavelli knew that truth is useless to those who can't weaponize it, and the prince was truth, sharpened into a blade. It spoke of rulers and survival. It stripped away illusions of kindness and justice. It told the reader, if you want to hold power, you must first accept what humanity really is. Not noble, not pure, but fearful, greedy, and driven by self-interest. He called it virtue, not virtue as in goodness, but the mastery of reality. To possess virtue was to bend fortune to your will, to control chaos by understanding its rhythm. He wrote that a ruler should be both fox and lion, the fox to recognize traps, the lion to frighten wolves. A ruler who tried to be loved would fail, because love depends on loyalty, and loyalty disappears when the wind changes. Fear, however, is constant. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Those words shook the foundations of every moral empire. But Machiavelli wasn't glorifying cruelty. He was exposing dependency. He knew fear was not about violence. It was about control. It was the invisible leash that guided obedience. He taught that appearance mattered more than truth. A leader could be ruthless. As long as he looked righteous, he could manipulate. As long as his followers felt protected, because people do not see the world as it is, they see it as it is presented to them. Machiavelli understood the greatest secret of all: perception is power. He wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you truly are." A ruler's survival depended not on honesty, but on the ability to play roles: saint, soldier, savior. Whatever the moment demanded. To rule effectively, one had to master illusion, not because deception is noble, but because truth is fragile in the hands of fools. He advised rulers to act decisively, to strike swiftly, to remove threats completely. Half measures were a sign of weakness, and weakness invited chaos. He believed that cruelty, when used with precision, could create order faster than compassion, a painful truth the world still denies. And yet, in his darkest teachings, there was a strange kind of morality, a morality of responsibility. He wrote that the ruler's duty is not to be good, but to keep the world from collapsing. If a lie prevents war, it is not evil. If fear maintains peace, it is not cruelty. Machiavelli redefined morality not by intention, but by consequence. He saw human nature as permanent, selfish, emotional, easily manipulated. To him, pretending otherwise was weakness. So he taught how to use that nature, not to destroy, but to direct. He wrote, "Men judge more with their eyes than with their hands. For everyone can see, but few can touch." He meant that people believe what they see, not what is true. That illusion, not reality, moves nations. And centuries later, his words would become the foundation of modern politics, corporate power, propaganda, and leadership. Presidents would quote him in secret. Generals would study him before battle. Businessmen would apply his lessons in boardrooms. Everywhere humans competed, Machiavelli's shadow followed. He didn't teach people how to become monsters. He taught them how to defend themselves from monsters. He wrote for those who were willing to see the world as it is, not as it pretends to be. But the irony was bitter. The world that used his wisdom still condemned his name. They called him manipulative, immoral, evil, and yet they followed his principles more than his prayers. The same leaders who banned his book-built empires, using his rules, because they knew Machiavelli had not written fiction. He had written the code of survival. He showed that morality without strategy is vulnerability, that kindness without control invites destruction, and that those who refuse to understand power become its victims. He once wrote, "Fortune is a woman. To master her, you must seize her boldly." It wasn't lust, it was metaphor. Fortune doesn't reward hesitation. The world belongs to those who act while others debate. That was the core of his message: control or be controlled. Machiavelli didn't want to corrupt humanity. He wanted to prepare it. He wanted to show that survival demands clarity, and clarity demands honesty about the dark. He believed the greatest intelligence is not to destroy evil, but to understand it so completely that it can no longer control you. The music rises, orchestral, heavy. He closed the prince and set it on his table. The candle flickered as if bowing to his creation. He had written the truth the world would never forgive him for. But somewhere deep down, he smiled, because he knew even those who condemned him would one day live by his rules. Fade out. Low voiceover whisper. The world doesn't belong to the pure. It belongs to those who understand impurity. Centuries have passed, but his shadow still lingers. The ink of the prince has faded, yet its message is immortal. Niccolò Machiavelli, the man exiled, condemned, misunderstood, became the ghost whispering in every throne room, every war room, every boardroom. He never ruled a kingdom, but he ruled the minds of those who did. His name became a word, Machiavellian, a symbol of cunning, manipulation, and control. But few ever understood what he truly meant. They saw him as cold, but he was precise. They called him immoral, but he was honest. He didn't invent darkness. He merely held up a mirror to it. Every era that followed proved him right. Kings who smiled while plotting blood. Politicians who promised heaven while selling fear. Corporations that mastered illusion better than truth. All of them, knowingly or not, walked the path he had drawn. Because the prince was not a prophecy, it was a diagnosis, a manual written for a sick species that calls itself civilized. Machiavelli understood something eternal. Human nature never evolves. It only learns to hide. Empires change names, rulers wear new faces, but the psychology of power remains the same. Men forget the death of their fathers sooner than the loss of their inheritance. That line, written 500 years ago, still beats through the heart of modern ambition. The hunger for control, the worship of image, the silent understanding that survival has no saints. From Napoleon to Churchill, from CEOs to presidents, his lessons echoed like commandments of realism. When a leader chooses fear over love, that's Machiavelli. When a government hides behind morality while chasing control, that's Machiavelli. When a company sells comfort while quietly feeding on attention, that's Machiavelli. He is the invisible mentor of modern power, and yet, most who quote him never truly read him. They take his words as permission to deceive, when in truth he was warning them, not celebrating corruption, but exposing its anatomy. He wasn't telling rulers to become monsters, he was telling humanity, this is what monsters look like. So recognize them. He believed knowledge was the only real weapon against manipulation. That understanding power is the first step in not being crushed by it. He saw the world as a stage, and everyone, an actor. Those who know the script control the play, those who don't are replaced. And that's why his ideas live forever. Because they are not bound by politics or time. They are bound to human nature itself. To understand Machiavelli is to understand ourselves, our fears, our greed, our desperate need to control what we cannot predict. The church damned him, philosophers attacked him, but the world adopted him. Even the moral ones could not resist the clarity of his mind, because beneath the darkness of his words there was truth, and truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. He wrote that fortune, fate, is like a river. You cannot stop its flood, but if you build strong banks, you can direct its flow. That's how he saw life, not as a tragedy, but as a test of control. He believed a man's intelligence is measured not by his dreams, but by his ability to shape reality. And so, long after his death, his name became both curse and crown. The curse for those who still cling to illusions. The crown for those who dare to face the world as it is. Today, his lessons echo louder than ever. In politics, in business, in every human relationship, every time someone smiles to hide intent, every time someone chooses strategy over emotion, every time a leader acts for the greater good through ruthless means, Machiavelli's ghost watches and nods. He would not call it evil, he would call it necessary. Because to him, good and evil were just languages the powerful used to justify their choices. What mattered was stability, order, control. He once wrote, "There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." He knew vision always breeds enemies, and perhaps that's why he died, uncelebrated, because he didn't tell the world what it wanted to hear. He told it what it needed to hear. That kindness without strength leads to ruin. That. Leadership without intelligence breeds chaos. That truth without timing becomes suicide. He never wanted worship. He wanted awareness, and that's what made him immortal. Music builds. Slow orchestral drums rise. They buried his body in Florence, but his mind never died. 5 centuries later, the world still runs on his rules. The actors have changed. The stage has evolved. But the play remains the same, because power still seduces, fear still controls, and illusion still rules the eyes of men. Voice slows to a final whisper. He wasn't a devil. He was a mirror, and in that reflection, we still see ourselves. The world is ruled not by angels, but by those who understand the minds of men. Machiavelli understood, and that's why, even from the grave, he still rules. Fade to black. End music.